Hi there, my name is Phil Irvin, Director of Marketing and Communications at the Saint Paul Seminary, and thrilled and honored to be joined by Father Tim Tran from the Archdiocese of Saint Paul in Minneapolis. Father, thanks for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Phil, for having me. I'm very excited and just grateful to have this conversation.
Looking forward to our conversation and have been for some time as I pull my notes up here on the old iPhone. Let's start by giving our viewers or listeners just a little bit of background on you. You were ordained in 2017, you said? Sorry, 2020.
2020.
My math is off. 2020 right. From the Saint Paul Seminary. Tell us what you've been up to since then and how the first few years of priesthood have been going for you.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I was ordained in 2020, right in the pandemic. I say hopefully 2020 vision. And so the Lord has great plans, I'm sure. After ordination, I was assigned to a parish in the northern suburbs called St. Odelia's in Shoreview. I was there for a couple years. And then since last July, I was transferred to be the associate as well at St. Stephen's in Anoka, Minnesota. It's been a great experience. It's been definitely a transition and also just a lot of learning. Especially at those parishes, I was helping out and serving the Spanish community too. So just a lot of learning from all my pastors I've been able to serve with. So
fantastic. And one of the things you've been involved with, I guess, is an add-on to your parish work. I'm sure it complements it. We don't want to separate the two, but been very involved with the National Eucharistic Revival here at the local level in the Twin Cities. What's been just kind of your role with the revival as it's kicked off here in the past year?
Sure. Yeah, no, my role is right now currently I'm called the point person for the Archdiocese to the National Eucharistic Revival.
So that's like the official Latin.
Yes, that's the official Latin title. Yeah,
Vatican imposed title.
That's
point
right.
Man.
The point man, point person, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, it's more or less. I'm kind of like the bridge between the USCCB, because as we know, this National Eucharistic Revival was called for by the Bishops' Conference. And so each diocese is called to have a point person to be kind of the bridge and a link from the national level to the local level. And so I was asked by Archbishop Hebda to kind of stand in that role here in a local church, at least for this coming up year as well, once it leads to the Congress. So,
sure.
Yeah.
So for those who maybe aren't familiar, what is the Eucharistic Revival? And as part of that, if you can explain maybe why it's necessary or why the Catholic Church in the U.S. has taken on this Eucharistic Revival.
Sure. Well, more or less, the National Eucharistic Revival is a call from all the bishops, a concerted effort to help all of our Catholics, and not only just Catholics, but all those in the country, to rediscover this fount of our faith, our Eucharistic faith, the source and summit, as we know, of our faith, called by Vatican II, which is the Eucharist itself, right? And what it kind of more or less was the impetus for this revival was this national study back in 2019 that kind of revealed a startling statistic. I'm sure we've heard a lot about that, where at least survey says of the persons who are attending Mass in the pews, that 2/3 of them do not understand what we believe as the true presence of Christ in what looks like bread and what looks like wine, those things that are consecrated by the priests in the celebration of the Mass. And so that's a starting statistic that really kind of plucked a chord in the bishops' hearts. And so together in a concerted effort in 2021, I believe, they had voted as a conference to start a 3-year process in the National Eucharistic Revival to be able to inculcate and rediscover this Eucharistic faith so that we can be a missionary disciple to our local churches and also in the United States.
Yeah, so what does that look like so far? You said, I guess, getting closer to kind of year 2 now, but what have you been doing here locally so far to bring about this revival in the Twin Cities specifically?
Sure. So what I've been doing is that I've been kind of chairing this steering committee with various persons, lay persons, priests, and religious throughout the Archdiocese to kind of more or less be assisting the Archbishop in giving him our consultations, some of our suggestions and directions in which we see and hear from the people in the pews, as well in our own individual work, of what might be the actions of the Holy Spirit in our local church. The beautiful thing about the revival, Phil, is that, this revival is going to look different everywhere you go.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're all in different stages of our Eucharistic faith. And, we can pick one area to focus on, such as maybe catechesis, a deeper understanding of the doctrine of the true presence, or maybe just a revitalization of our liturgies, the way that we celebrate Mass and worship, or just adoration, spirituality. There can be so many things, and every local church needs to discern that. What's been a beautiful thing, but also a challenge too, is that we've been in a synod process, as we know here in the Archdiocese, Saint Paul, Minneapolis. And so how can the revival, at least nationally in my role, how can we assist Archbishop, right, in that effort? Because that's been a united effort for our local church here, even before the pandemic as well. And so how can those two integrate with one another and collaborate and help with the implementation that the Archbishop has called for? So that's been the challenge, but also exciting as well.
Yeah.
We did this past year a few different events. Back in November, we had the relics of the patrons of the National Revival, Blessed Carlo Acutis, and also Saint Manuel Gonzalez Garcia, a Spanish bishop. Those are the two patrons of the National Eucharistic Revival. We had their first-class relics come into town, and so we had a few different events just to kind of spark a fire. One of the great events that you kind of helped with was the Cor Jesu event back in November at the cathedral. And so I think those little events have sparked a little fire and kind of sparked an interest, but also put the revival on the map at least, so for people to hear and see.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge and opportunity, you said, right? You want to create spaces for people to really encounter the Lord in a unique way. So, bringing in relics. Cor Jesu was this beautiful Friday evening of praise and worship with thousands of Catholics. But we also want that spark to kind of be ignited and just sort of ever burning like a pilot light in our everyday life, right? Yeah. So how do we go from some of those kind of peak moments or events to just kind of internalizing that and carrying that Eucharistic fire around just kind of in the smaller, maybe mundane ways, would you say?
Yeah, it's about Eucharistic living.
Yeah.
How do we ourselves live that Eucharistic faith in such a way that it's very attractive, right? As I mentioned a little bit earlier, this revival can take so many shapes and forms, different directions, and all those are valid. But the biggest question I think that we need to answer, which more or less I've been proposing to the committee I've been steering and to those that I've been able to give talks and retreats to, is, we call it a Eucharistic revival, but what is it that we are reviving, right?
Yeah.
That's very important, because if we can't answer that question, then all the planning, all the programming, all the events, it wouldn't have a necessary particular end, right? It can be a wonderful 3-year process, which is able to maybe make us excited and maybe elicit a lot of emotion, expending a lot of energy and time and even a treasure in terms of financial means, but it might not stick, right? So the question is, what is it that we are reviving? And that's extremely important. So more or less, I try to tell people, because they've been asking, Father Tim, so what do you want us to do here in the local church? I've been getting some emails like, that's a great question. What do you think that we should do, right? In your own local parishes, with collaboration with your pastors, what have you guys been discerning that is necessary here to invigorate this spark of our Eucharistic faith for your parishioners? And so my job is to hopefully facilitate that and to help people discern, to think about some of those questions, to sit back and reflect and allow the Spirit to lead, and we can follow the Lord that way. Yeah.
Beautiful. I want to go back to that Pew Research stat you brought up. How do we get here,
Yeah.
in your estimation?
That's a very good question. I've been thinking a lot about that. We can pinpoint some ways in the history of the last 50 years, perhaps. I think there's perhaps maybe a general consensus, perhaps in the 1960s, with the social turmoil that was already going on, not only internationally, but even here nationally in our country, with the sexual revolution, with the coming out of the Second Vatican Council, and the interpretations of which maybe had led to some of the consequences in which maybe catechesis or even devotions might have been not necessarily, I wouldn't say eliminated, but maybe depreciated in some way. And so, but I don't want to be too simplistic, honestly, because
it's definitely a loaded question.
It is a loaded question.
How
do we get here? If we just kind of look back, I do think that it has roots even much prior to that, especially like in the Industrial Revolution and all the consequences in the early 20th century that kind of perhaps because of the 1960s and that turmoil kind of was exacerbated at that time. More or less, I can just pinpoint to, the growth of relativism in our current day and age, that radical individualism, secularism too, because it'll be interesting to know about the statistic, right? The statistic here is done here in the United States, right? And it'll be interesting. I don't know how the survey was conducted, nor the persons being surveyed, but I would say it's pretty accurate in terms of that's more or less the geography of the church, state of belief in the West, right? And so it would be interesting to survey the same thing in other local churches throughout the world to see where their Eucharistic faith is.
Right.
So I think that'll be good data to know.
Yeah.
In the United States,
if it's different, start digging into why, right?
That's right. And in our United States, we're such a conglomeration of so many different ethnicities, immigrants, immigrant churches. And so to know those statistics too, I'm just going off with my gut here that I would suspect that a lot of immigrant groups, just from the fact of me experiencing their Eucharistic faith through their liturgies and going to their parishes, I see a little bit of a larger spark in general versus the general population perhaps in the United States.
Yeah. Lots of layers to it. Does it get you at least a little fired up as a relatively young priest to be part of a church that is addressing it head on? You got this big 2,000-year-old, sometimes perceived as archaic institution that sees Pew Research finding something like this, and in relatively short order has really, I think, activated, and with priests like you and leaders like you to, it's like the run, hide, fight thing, right? Like we're working on it. We're trying to address it and not burying our heads in the sand. What's that been like to just be on the front lines of that, I guess? Yeah,
it's been actually a real privilege. It's a great honor too, but the one question that I've been kind of mulling on too is that if this research never was published, right? If this statistic was never existed, would we also have the same angst, the same passion, the same vigor of doing this revival?
Yeah.
You see what I'm trying to say? Because we want to respond, right? And I think in every generation of the church, just looking historically, there have been people who responded to the needs of the time.
Yeah.
And something for us to think about too is that in our 21st century, especially American context with efficiencies and things like that, we rely a lot upon on surveys and numbers and statistics, right?
We love our analytics more than ever right now. That's very true. Yeah,
it can be very helpful and it's informative, but it can't be the sole foundation for which we start a movement or respond to something. And so that's the question too: is what are we responding to, or are we just reacting? Right. The goal of the revival, in my opinion, should not to be reversing a statistic, right? Because statistics can be so easy to just look at numbers and forget that behind those numbers are persons, and that's the beauty of our faith, is that it's rooted in a personal God, a personal relationship, an encounter, a conversation, a dialogue that you and I are having, versus some kind of ephemeral kind of notion of numbers,
Yeah.
And if you just look at all the movements in the past, we don't have statistics on those, such as the Franciscan order, the Dominican order, the Jesuits, all those wonderful movements that were just organic.
Yeah.
And those saints themselves did not set out to reverse some sort of social trend, right? They just set out because they saw a need and they responded, and they just live their life in such a radical and attractive way. And so, in my opinion, that should be the impetus for our revival, a much more organic way. It might not produce numbers. It might not even produce a statistic, because at the end of these 3 years, we want to do a survey again and see how much people really believe in the true presence. I don't think that's the way to go.
Yeah. It's deeper than that. Much
deeper than that. And to be quite honest with you, the fruits are going to happen after we die and see the Lord.
I'm sure you've seen that just in your ministry in a lot of ways. You plant the seed, you spread the truth, you do what you feel like God's calling you to do, and sometimes you get to see the tangible fruit of that, but a lot of times, at least this side of eternity, you don't, right? Thank God we have the church, sort of.
Yeah.
Guiding and steering all that, right?
Yeah, blessed are those who not see and believe, right? In the Easter season here with St. Thomas and the risen Lord, we just got to continue to sow the seeds of the gospel, be joyful witnesses. Sometimes the best seeds that we sow aren't the ones that coming out of our hands, I say. Yeah. It's the best seeds that we sow sometimes is coming from the holes in our bags that we don't even know where the seeds are falling, right? And those are the secret seeds that the Lord sows because of our own brokenness and weakness. And that's the greatest fruit, because, it's the Lord who does the work, really.
Yeah. Awesome. I'll have to admit it was a little difficult preparing for this interview, and particularly this next question I have written down. So I'm going to do my best, because it's like, hey, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to talk to this ordained man. We have like a certain amount of time. We're going to talk about these super profound, supernatural things like bread and wine turning into a dead and risen man's body and blood. Like, it's really, it's hard, at least for a layman like me, to sort of boil it down into these little nuggets we see in our social feeds, It's such a profound mystery we're talking about when we talk about the true presence. But can you, in as clear and succinct as possible, at least start to get at maybe some of the quote-unquote proofs for why and how Jesus is actually truly present in the Eucharist, and maybe equip our viewers with just some ways to, if not completely have that conversation in a short amount of time, at least start to get at, how can we actually say that it is really Jesus up there on the altar?
That's a good question. Hopefully I can try to be as succinct as I can. At the foundation of the Christian faith is more or less, is Jesus who he says he is, right? Is Jesus who he says he is? And if he says who he says he is, will he do what he says he's going to do? And where do we know what he said? Or how do we know what he said? What's through the scriptures or written down through the centuries? And, some of the proofs we can perhaps say, I can think of two right now. Firstly, through the scriptures itself, where we believe that it's been inspired by the Holy Spirit. And it's a written account, at least the Gospels and the New Testament, of Jesus' life here in this world, and after he resurrected and ascended to the heaven, the ministry of his apostles in the early church. We see that in everything that he said and done. His word has effect, right? He says something and something happens. Your sins are forgiven. Go in peace, right? His words affect something. And so a lot of the proof texts we see about the Eucharist is John chapter 6. Obviously, that's more or less the bread of life discourse, where even St. John writes that after Jesus says, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood," there was a lot of people who were kind of turned off about this, And Jesus uses figures of speech, right? We know that. Sometimes he means things literally. Sometimes he uses parables to communicate a deeper truth. And in this case, we can sense that he was actually talking something in a literal sense, because his disciples left him. Right. And if he was just speaking metaphorically, he would say, "Hey, you got me wrong here."
Yeah. No, come back. I meant this.
Yeah, I meant that this is just a symbol of my body. He never says that. But he just turns to Peter and says, "Will you also leave?" And he says, Peter responds, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life." Right? And at the Last Supper, he says, "Take and eat all of you. This is my body. This is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." And the disciples took that very literally, because after the resurrection, we see them celebrating, right, the breaking of the bread in their homes in the early nascent church, right? And the disciples, after the resurrection, noticed or recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread, such as the road to Emmaus, right? The one example I want to use about this is, words can affect reality, right? It can affect our own dispositions, right? So if I say, this is the worst interview ever, this sucks, and you're the worst interviewer ever, that would affect something in your own disposition, right? You're gonna experience, some sadness, maybe, some disappointment, and you're just maybe even offended. The reality of your disposition has changed because of the words I used, versus how I can respond to you saying, this is a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate all the time and effort you put into this, right? That changes your disposition too. That creates some joy, some happiness, right? And so that's the kind of a very loose analogy that I say, that our words can affect reality. It can make someone's day or break someone's day, right? It changes a real disposition in someone's soul too. If our words like that in this world are able to affect somebody's disposition, reality, how much more profound is the Word made flesh in Jesus, right? Where he doesn't just affect our dispositions, he transforms something literally by his word. And so I just use that for us to kind of really think about how some proof texts. And secondly, we just look at, the proof is in the continuation of this belief throughout 2,000-year history. The church still celebrates Mass, right? Although maybe the external rituals might be different from the ancient rites, but the essence is still there, And the proof lies in that the disciples took it literally when Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me." They did it before they wrote it down, right? The celebration of the Mass existed before the Scriptures, at least the New Testament, the Gospels were written, right? And so that in itself, I think, is a proof of that Eucharistic faith that our forefathers, our ancestors, and the saints who came before us believed, right? And then thirdly, we can talk a lot about the supernatural manifestations of the true presence, such as bread and wine miraculously turning into flesh and blood, which is documented throughout history through the Eucharistic miracles, right? So that can also be some ways a proof of of Jesus' claim that this is his body, this is his blood, right?
Do you have a favorite Eucharistic miracle that you've studied up on or latched onto or kind of dove into?
Yeah,
you can pick more than one too.
Yeah, there's a lot here. Back in October at St. Stephen's, I was able to bring in this traveling exhibit of the Eucharistic miracles. So Blessed Carlo Acutis, the Italian teenager, kind of tech whiz.
Yeah.
He kind of documented all of the substantiated claims, and also I think the miraculous claims that were approved miracles by the church. He documented that as a teenager, and he created this exhibit for them. And so we were able to get that at St. Stephen's for a week. Honestly, I don't know many Eucharistic miracles, but the one that I still remember, because when I was a teenager, my youth leaders took me to one of the exhibits just like that we had hosted. It was at another local church. I think it might have been St. John the Evangelist in Little Canada. But we went there, and the only one I remember is Lanciano, the miracle of Lanciano. I think it was perhaps maybe the 16th century, maybe. I might be wrong.
We won't hold you to it. Yeah. A while back.
A long time ago. Yeah, and the host turned into flesh. Yeah. And then also the blood, the wine turned into lumps of blood. And there was a lot of scientific tests done in the mid 20th century, which kind of showed that, the flesh that was studied from the host that had changed was cardiac tissue and was still alive. And same with the lumps of blood. The one thing I remember was that there was 5 lumps of blood, and when they weighed them all collectively, it was one weight. But when they weighed each individual clump individually, it was the same weight as though collectively, right? So scientists couldn't really explain that. And also, the blood also was still alive as well, too, after hundreds of years. So that's the one that really stuck to me as a kid.
Yeah.
And it still reminds me, it's like, wow, There's something substantiated here. Not that we need to have those miracles for our Eucharistic faith. Right. Sometimes the Lord acts extraordinarily to remind us that this faith is true, is real. Not that the Lord or God needs to do that, because our faith should be substantiated on supernatural phenomena that occurs out of the ordinary.
Right.
Yeah.
It affirms our belief. It doesn't create it, bring it about. How about Eucharistic patron or saint? I know you mentioned Carlo Acutis a couple times, but are there any saints that have been particularly, important through your formation and now your ministry that had a Eucharistic devotion that stuck out to you? Or I'm sure they all did, I guess, in some way, but
exactly right. Every saint has a deep devotion to the Lord, especially in the Eucharist. For me, I have 3 very close friends. I call them friends. Saint John Paul II, Saint Therese, and then one whom I hope before I die in this world will be beatified or be lifted up to sainthood is Venerable Cardinal Francis Xavier Nguyen Van Thuan, a Vietnamese cardinal.
Okay.
Saint John Paul II and Saint Therese, many people know about their stories, but Cardinal Van Thuan, he had a very amazing story. Because he was imprisoned by the communists in Vietnam after Saigon fell in 1975. Wow. He was imprisoned for 13 years, 9 of which were in solitary confinement. The most famous story of his is that he celebrated Mass in the palms of his hands with 3 drops of wine and 1 drop of blood in one palm, and then the other palm was just a fragment of bread. And so he would celebrate Mass in the palms of his hands, and that was kind of his lifeblood. While in extreme torture and silence and solitude. So his life is quite phenomenal, and I think perhaps, in my opinion, he's one of the Eucharistic patrons, in my opinion, just by the way that he lived the Eucharistic faith in his episcopacy. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing, and thanks for sharing that too, because for all the Thereses and John Pauls that are out there, there are these stories of people kind of moving up the ranks, right? Someone gets beatified and more of us learn about them, but the Lord works in all of us, and so to spread those stories from people like that is phenomenal. So switching gears a little bit, Father, how about some practical ways that Catholics can share the truth about the Eucharist, either with their fellow Catholics who maybe are at a different level in their understanding of the true presence, or other Christians, non-Catholics? Obviously every conversation is a little different, but what are some practical ways we can do that?
Sure. I'm going to use Therese as an example. She's a great friend and a great sister. It's amazing how a 23 or 24-year-old nun in a Carmel in Lisieux became the patroness of missionaries, right? Someone who never left the 4 walls of her convent, someone who was actually unknown during her short time in this world. And it wasn't until she died that she became more effective. And so her biggest thing was, living love in those little ways, right? Her little way. I believe in our time and age, certainly apologetics is very important, right? It's essential to our faith to be able to expound on the doctrines and tenets of our faith, to be able to explain it in a convicting way. That's very important. But also, I do think that the way that you live your faith, the way you witness it, whether by words or by actions, I would say probably more by actions nowadays, because there's a lot of words out there,
no doubt,
especially in the communications and social media world, and those words can be so construed.
Yeah.
Where now I think the principal means by which we can evangelize is just by our silent witness, the way that we love. They will know that we're Christians by the way that we love, right? And so the joy that we exude, that fragrance, right? Saint Therese was of the little flower. I use that because the fragrance is something that sticks to me, and at least has become a modus operandi of how I try to live my faith as a priest. To evangelize is, I use this example because not by experience, but maybe, we have a kindred spirit because we're both men, right?
Yeah.
And so, there's 2 ways to get a teenage boy out of his room in the basement. right? Especially when in the basement, it's all dark. He has his headphones on. He's watching TV or playing video games for hours on end, right? We don't know. God knows what he's doing. So there's two ways to get a teenage boy out of his room. You can go downstairs and pound on the door and say, "Hey, what the heck are you doing? Get out of here!" Right? And he'll get out, but he'll be pretty angry about it.
Yeah.
Or, as a parent, because I believe you're a father, right, Phil? As a parent, you cook a nice meal, right? Let the fragrance seep through the cracks. He'll smell it for himself. He'll take off his earbuds. He'll turn off the TV. He'll get up, walk to the door, reach for the handle, open the door, walk up the stairs and says, "Mom, Dad, what are you cooking?"
Yeah.
Right? And Mom, Dad would say, "Sit down and have dinner," right? And I think that that's a more effective way of evangelizing, especially in today's day and age. It's a longer process. It's more intentional. It takes more time. But I do think that's more effective. And so that fragrance of how we live our life, our struggle towards sanctity every day, will make a profound difference. That was the impetus and the genesis of every single movement that has transformed the world, especially in the Catholic context, from the beginnings of the nascent church today.
Absolutely. Let's talk about you a little more. Let's go back to your vocation story. What role did the Eucharist, adoration, those types of things kind of play in your discernment as you discerned seminary, went through seminary? The Lord's obviously been working in your life, but how, especially through the Eucharist?
I never thought about being a priest at all. And I would say the seeds of my vocation came from my participation in this movement called the Vietnamese Eucharistic Youth Movement, VEYM for short. I don't know if you ever heard about it.
No.
We're kind of very secluded, but it has origins in France, then moved over to Vietnam, and then after the war, with immigration, it moved over towards the United States and all around the globe. But it's Eucharistic in its essence. It's kind of like Catholic Boy Scout and Girl Scouts. Have you ever seen them? We have scarves, different colors, different age groups, and things like that. We have badges. So it's pretty kind of military-like too. It teaches you leadership. But what really kind of sowed the seeds of adoration in me was that, at one point when I started the youth group dwindled down to about 25 young kids. That's pretty small for us. At one point we had like 125, right? Every Saturday we would have that many kids come. But so for some reason it all dwindled down. And I learned this later that our chaplain at the time, an associate, he's with the Lord now, Father Andrew Sang, he met with the youth leaders and he says, you guys need to pray together to go back to adoration, the Eucharist, bring the children to adoration. Huh? And it's from that moment on that every Saturday, as part of our hour and a half to 2 hours youth group, every age group would go and visit the Eucharist for about 10 to 15 minutes. Our leaders would just lead us in silence, read the gospel, give a reflection or something like that, sing a song. But I remember as a kid, I hated it because it interrupted our fun. We were playing games. But afterwards, I started to realize that was one of the most sacred moments in my week. I started to know that in the silence I can be with the Lord. I can give him my joys. I can give him my struggles, and also converse with him. Right? And so I think, personally, I think that was really what sparked it. And the rest is history, confirmation retreat, and things like that. And during discernment of the priesthood, I visited the Adoration Chapel quite often, either going to and from work. There was a perpetual Adoration Chapel on the way to work, and I would stop by for 10 to 15 minutes, or sometimes an hour, half an hour, just to surrender the discernment to the Lord. So just being in silence there was really important for the development of my priesthood and the vocational call.
Yeah. Both your parents Vietnamese?
Yeah, both my parents are Vietnamese.
Okay.
They're both living still too. Yeah.
Awesome. Did they immigrate here, or what's the backstory there?
Yeah, my family immigrated here in 1993.
Okay.
I still remember it. December 3rd, 1993.
You remember it. So how old were you?
I was three and a half-ish.
Oh, wow. So it's like one of your first
One of the first
memories
memories.
then.
My first memory of the United States is coming off the airplane tarmac.
No way.
And
Wow.
you've been to Terminal 1 and it's all glass.
Yeah.
All I remember was
MSP.
MSP.
Yeah.
Yeah. All I remember was just completely white. Completely white. That's the first time I've seen snow, as a kid.
Yeah.
That's all I remember. And I remember my brother says it wasn't a taxi, but I believe it was a taxi because obviously that's the only thing we know about getting to and from. But I remember the door of the car opening up and taking my first step in snow. So that's my earliest memories of
That's appropriate when you come straight to Minnesota.
Yeah.
From Vietnam, I guess. So. Yeah. And then you're born and raised here, and
more or
Twin
less.
Cities.
Yeah, Twin Cities, Minnesota. Was Minnesotan through and through.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, we're glad you're here now. Thank you so much for the conversation and
thanks
for your wisdom and insights. Any parting words or thoughts on the Eucharist, the revival that you want to share with our viewers as we kind of move forward? I guess we should maybe talk about kind of what's next. We got the Eucharistic Congress coming up. Maybe tell people what that's all about.
Sure.
Then we'll wrap it up here. But
yeah, the exciting thing is, this National Eucharistic Revival is a 3-year process to spark a fire. And it culminates in 2024 at the National Eucharistic Congress. It's the first one nationally, at least, in over 70 years. And fun fact, the last time we had a National Eucharistic Congress was here in Saint Paul in 1941. The last international one that the United States hosted was 1976 in Philadelphia. So it's pretty cool that the relationship of our local church to the national broader scale. And so it will culminate in July of 2024 with a 5-day Congress in Indianapolis. So please visit eucharisticrevival.org for more information if you'd like to sign up for that.
That's open to anyone.
Yes, open to anyone.
Yeah.
Open to anyone. I think it's also they're having plans to make it family friendly.
Yeah.
So I think children are able to attend too. The details of which will be forthcoming.
Sure.
What's coming up, at least locally here, we're just trying to get an opportunity to. What I say is just. Remember when we began, I said, we call it the Eucharistic Revival. What is it that we are reviving? And after reflection, if it's nothing other than the mystical body of Christ, right? Which is instantiated in you and I as baptized members of Christ's body. If it's nothing other than to revive us, right? And more than a self-help program, right? Because we hear about self-care all the time, right? And that can be very individualistic and can be very me-focused, but in a holistic way, to revive us, our Eucharistic faith, our belief, our spirituality, our hunger for the transcendent, the spiritual, reviving us in that recognition of how God has created us, by whom we're created and for whom we're created, to revive that, right? And so if we see that as a revival, what we're trying to do in this next year is just getting the pieces of grain, the members of that one bread, the mystical body, into the oven, right? Because it's the Holy Spirit that does the work. So put the bread in the oven, right? Light the fire, Holy Spirit. Put the bread in the oven, smell the aroma, spread the fragrance, right? That's it. How it's going to come about? Will we come about through people's dispositions, their hearts open when we gather together as Christ's body and their spirituality with the Lord to allow Him to speak to their hearts, right? It's going to happen. It's already happening, but it's just going to be invigorated even more so. So just stay tuned, especially in October here, coming up in 2023 in our local church, when, just a hint, St. Therese and her parents will be coming from France. Their major relics will be coming here. That's a big deal. And so
huge deal.
Huge deal, right? And so super excited. We're going to do a lot of different events there with the only one goal of just getting the members of Christ's body together, praying together, allowing the Holy Spirit to transform our life. We're going to smell the aroma. We're going to spread that fragrance, and the revival is just going to happen organically. Don't know what's going to what's in the pipeline for that. Obviously, we're going to have tangible events, tangible catechesis, and things like that. That's certainly along with it, but I think the spiritual aspect is much more important, and the saints are interceding for us from heaven.
So good. We'll end on that. I don't think we're going to top that. Be sure to scroll down, click read more in the description, because we'll throw in some links with this piece on Eucharistic Revival, Eucharistic Congress, some of the things that are happening locally here in the Twin Cities as well. So be sure to keep an eye out for that and all the great work that Father Tim and his team are doing. Father, thank you again so much for your time and your wisdom and insights. It's been a great conversation, and looking forward to seeing what comes next.
Yeah, thank you very much, Phil. I appreciate the invite.
And thank you for watching. Be sure to check out stpaulseminary.org. You can also follow the seminary on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We'll talk to you all soon. Thanks so much, and God bless.